Okay, welcome back to the third scene of Stave 4 in our annotation and discussion of Dickens's A Christmas Carol. As always, I'll read the extract first and then we'll go through the annotations. He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare uncurtained bed on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released, it is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealing, griping cares? They have brought him to a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let us go. Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. Again it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length, the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. Is it good, she said, or bad? To help him. Bad, he answered. We are quite ruined? No, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with a death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be for ever present to me. Okay, and that is the end of this much shorter extract from Stave 4. So let's have a look at why this scene is important. The first thing that you need to know is that the figure upon the bed is in fact Scrooge's. He is standing just a few feet away from his own corpse. And even though he can't look beneath the sheet, he is filled with this sense of complete horror. So Scrooge is in the dead man's room, and he stands next to the bed upon which the corpse, his own, lies. The room is really dark, and this means that he can't see clearly where he is. So Scrooge is unable to see that he's in his own room and that the body covered by a sheet is his own. So again, Scrooge is still in ignorance of some of the facts surrounding this man's death. Dickens notes that the body is plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for. And Dickens uses this series of adjectives to emphasise the pitiful state of the body. So the dead man's unmourned and unloved, reduced to the state of a poor man by the thieves who have stolen the shirt from it and the bed curtains that shielded it. So this is the body after it's been ransacked in the way that we saw described in the previous scene. And just look at the sort of pitiful state that this man has been left in. He's unwatched, unwept, so no one is sitting watching over the body. There's no one sitting in a vigil. There's nobody crying over him. There's nobody caring for him. And it's simply described as the body of the man. So the ghost sort of gestures towards the sheet which is covering the head, and Scrooge longs to see the dead man's face, but he can't bring himself to pull back the sheet. So again he remains in ignorance of who is lying there. Nevertheless, he reflects upon the idea of death, but he notes that a good person doesn't need to fear death. If someone's lived a good life and is honourable, they will be remembered and their spirit will live on. So remember that Dickens was writing obviously in a strictly Christian era, which believed that if you had lived a good life, obviously your spirit would be conveyed to heaven and you would live on happily there. There's this idea of life immortal. So he thinks about the fact that a good person doesn't need to fear death. Death can't hurt them in any way. But nevertheless, his thoughts are of quite a gloomy tone, and he starts to wonder as well, if this man were to be brought back to life now, what would his first thoughts be? So he's slowly gaining more self-awareness. He's reflecting on the kind of life that he thinks this man may have lived. And he realises that this man's life, focused on material wealth, has brought him to an unhappy, lonely, isolated end. So the parallels between the life of this dead man and Scrooge's own are obvious to Scrooge. He's making the connections there quite naturally, but he still does not know that he's looking upon his own corpse. And obviously we know that this realisation would hit him very, very hard. He begs to leave, and he is saying that he's learned his lesson. He says, in leaving this place, I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. So again, he thinks that he's learned everything that he needs to from this scene that he's witnessed, but we know that there is still this key detail that he is missing, and the ghost points towards the head. So the ghost seems insistent that Scrooge pull back the cloth and reveal the dead man's face, but Scrooge doesn't have the courage to do so. He says, I would do it if I could. Again, Scrooge chooses to remain ignorant and in doing so protect himself from the harsh truth. Now, the scene is to some extent open to interpretation. We know that Scrooge is invisible and inaudible in any of the scenes that he visits in the past, present or future. So this could be interpreted that Scrooge is physically powerless to move the cloth back. He can't actually affect the scene that he's standing in. So he could be literally powerless, in which case this moment of revelation is prolonged. It's put back until later in the novel. And this is sort of a building of suspense up until that moment where he finally does discover who is being spoken of. But another interpretation is that at this point in time he lacks the courage to do that. He wants to know who's lying there, but at the same time he can't bring himself to do it. He would prefer to remain ignorant. Obviously, this is one of the major sins that Scrooge is guilty of, and which the ghosts are forcing him to reconsider and to confront. So it's up to you how you want to interpret this scene. So the ghost again seems to look upon him, and Scrooge begs, if there's anyone who feels emotion caused by this man's death, take me to him. However, the scene that he's going to be shown isn't what he expects. These people certainly do feel emotion, but it's not perhaps the sadness that Scrooge anticipates seeing. So we're brought to the home of a poor young couple, and we have the wife waiting at home for her husband to return from wherever he has been. And his poverty, when he returns, has led him to look careworn and depressed. So despite his youth, he still looks tired, he still looks unhappy. So Dickens really illustrates here the relentlessness of poverty. It seems to have prematurely aged this man. He's about to reveal that the man to whom he is in debt, that he and his wife have been in debt to, Scrooge, has died. He feels serious delight. So there's this remarkable expression on his face, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed. So he's happy because this burden has been lifted from him, but he's still ashamed of feeling that happiness because obviously he's expressing joy at the death of someone else, which is wrong. And that sort of shame suggests that he is a moral man, unlike the merchants or the thieves seen earlier in the Stave. Okay, so they have a long conversation in which his wife suggests, are we quite ruined? And he says, we're not, there is hope yet. She expresses some surprise, saying, if he relents, if this person, Scrooge, has shown sympathy, then there is absolutely hope, if such a miracle has happened. When she finds out that he's dead, we see as well she's thankful in her soul to hear it, but then immediately prays for forgiveness. So similarly to the Cratchits, these people are presented by Dickens as kind of virtuous and deserving poor people. They're not like the criminals that we've seen previously in Stave 3, who've robbed the clothes off Scrooge's body and the bed sheets and the bed curtains from round his bed. These are poor people who deserve a better condition in life. She says, to whom will our debt be transferred? And he responds, before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. So he says, even if our debt is transferred to somebody else and we're not able to pay them off straight away, we'd be very unlucky indeed if our next debt collector was as merciless as Scrooge is, as lacking in kindness and as unforgiving. So the ghost, despite his omnipotence, his extraordinary power, has been unable to find anyone made unhappy by this man's death. Even this family, who are clearly good and kind people, only benefit from the loss of the merciless creditor that they describe. Even though they're still in debt, they can't imagine anyone harsher than the dead man, Scrooge. The future, therefore, that the ghost presents here is a bleak one. It appears that the death of this man, Scrooge, has only improved the lives of others. So again, we are reminded that this ghost is here to teach Scrooge a particularly harsh moral lesson. This is the future that awaits him if he doesn't change his ways. Now, Scrooge, as he's watching all of these scenes unfold, is trying to puzzle out the connections between them. He's trying to ascertain and to solve the mystery of these riddles, because he doesn't understand that the thing that they have in common is that all of these people are discussing his own death. He thinks that he's simply being shown the death of a man similar to him, and that this is the life and this is the future that he should avoid. But obviously he's kind of already learned that lesson from the ghost of Jacob Marley. This is the future that awaits him, this miserable, isolated, lonely, unmourned death. Okay, we will continue with Stave 4 in our next video, and we will be looking at the future that awaits the Cratchit family. Thanks for listening. I hope this has been helpful.